12a Guess at the riddle. The following is extracted from notes that Peirce wrote in preparation for a never-completed book that would have defended his metaphysical categories firstness, secondness, and thirdness by showing how they might explain the basic principles of logic, psychology, physiology, biology, physics, sociology, and theology. Had the book been written, it would have been, as Peirce says below, one of the births of time and certainly the preeminent achievement of 19th-century American philosophy. Nevertheless, Peirce did cover many of the planned topics in articles published during his lifetime, some of which are reprinted in this volume. Printed in the selection below is Peirce's outline for the entire book, all of what he wrote of Chapter I, and part of what he wrote of Chapter 5. Chapter I is a clear description of his categories, especially of thirdness. In the 5th chapter Peirce strives for a neurological account of thought as thirdness. This was a radical alternative to conventional neurological accounts of thought, which were usually written from the traditional perspective of either Cartesian dualism or simple materialism. Dualists allowed for neurological descriptions of thought as the physical side of psychophysical parallelism. Materialists viewed thought as an entirely neurological process but described the process in terms of dyadic relations or brute force, the action of one object in striking a second. This unrealistically denied, Peirce believed, the element of spontaneity in thought. The assertion that the process involved a mediating third object enabled Peirce to describe thought as a process of triadic relations involving representation of the first object by the sign, third, and interpretation of the sign by the interpreton, second. The superiority of this model, in Peirce's view, was that it allowed for realistic recognition that although thinking is a material, neurological process, it cannot be explained in terms of dyadic relations, that is, as a mechanical process of action and reaction. The part of Chapter 5 that is omitted moves to a still more basic physiological level by explaining thought in terms of the properties of protoplasm, a topic dealt with in Selection 14, Man's Glassy Essence. Source, MS 909. Chapter 1. 1, 2, 3. Already written. Chapter 2. The triad in reasoning. Not touched. It is to be made as follows. 1. 3 kinds of signs, as best shown in my last paper in the AM Jour Math. 2. Term, proposition, and argument, mentioned in my paper on a new list of categories. 3. 3 kinds of argument, deduction, induction, hypothesis, as shown in my paper in Studies in Logic. Also 3 figures of syllogism, as shown there and in my paper on the classification of arguments. 4. 3 kinds of terms, absolute, relative, and conjugative, as shown in my first paper on logic of relatives. There are various other triads which may be alluded to. The dual divisions of logic result from a false way of looking at things absolutely. Thus, besides affirmative and negative, there are really probable enunciations, which are intermediate. So besides universal and particular there are all sorts of propositions of numerical quantity. For example, the particular proposition sum A is B, means at least one A is B. But we can also say at least two A's are B's. Also, all the A's but one are B's, etc. ad infinitum. We pass from dual quantity, or a system of quantities such as that of Boolean algebra, where there are only two values, to plural quantity. Chapter 3. The triad in metaphysics. This chapter, one of the best, is to treat of the theory of cognition. Chapter 4. The triad in psychology. The greater part is written. Chapter 5. The triad in physiology. The greater part is written. Chapter 6. The triad in biology. This is to show the true nature of the Darwinian hypothesis. Chapter 7. The triad in physics. The germinal chapter. 1. The necessity of a natural history of the laws of nature, so that we may get some notion of what to expect. 2. The logical postulate for explanation forbids the assumption of any absolute. That is, it calls for the introduction of thirdness. 3. Metaphysics is an imitation of geometry, and mathematicians having declared against axioms, the metaphysical axioms are destined to fall too. 4. Absolute chance. 5. The universality of the principle of habit. 6. The whole theory stated. 7. Consequences. Chapter 8. The triad in sociology, or shall I say pneumatology. That the consciousness is a sort of public spirit among the nerve cells. Man as a community of cells, compound animals and composite plants, society, nature. Feeling implied in firstness. Chapter 9. The triad in theology. Faith requires us to be materialists without flinching. Notes for a book, to be entitled, A Guess at the Riddle with a vignette of the SPHYNX below the title. And this book if ever written, as it soon will be if I am in a situation to do it, will be one of the births of time. Chapter I. Trichotomy. Perhaps I might begin by noticing how different numbers have found their champions. 2 was extolled by Peter Ramus, 4 by Pythagoras, 5 by Sir Thomas Browne, and so on. For my part, I am a determined foe of no innocent number, I respect and esteem them all their several ways, but I am forced to confess to a leaning to the number 3 in philosophy. In fact, I make so much use of threefold divisions in my speculations, that it seems best to commence by making a slight preliminary study of the conceptions upon which all such divisions must rest. I mean no more than the ideas of first, second, third ideas so broad that they may be looked upon rather as moods or tones of thought, than as definite notions, but which have great significance for all that. Viewed as numerals, to be applied to what objects we like, they are indeed thin skeletons of thought, if not mere words. If we only wanted to make enumerations, it would be out of place to ask for the significations of the numbers we should have to use, but then the distinctions of philosophy are supposed to attempt something far more than that, they are intended to go down to the very essence of things, and if we are to make one single threefold philosophical distinction, it behooves us to ask beforehand what are the kinds of objects that are first, second, and third, not as being so counted, but in their own true characters. That there are such ideas of the really first, second, and third, we shall presently find reason to admit. The first is that whose being is simply in itself, not referring to anything nor lying behind anything. The second is that which is what it is by force of something to which it is second. The third is that which is what it is owing to things between which it mediates and which it brings into relation to each other. The idea of the absolutely first must be entirely separated from all conception of or reference to anything else, for what involves a second is itself a second to that second. The first must therefore be present and immediate, so as not to be second to a representation. It must be fresh and new, for if old it is second to its former state. It must be initiative, original, spontaneous, and free, otherwise it is second to a determining cause. It is also something vivid and conscious, so only it avoids being the object of some sensation. It precedes all synthesis and all it avoids being the object of some sensation. It precedes all synthesis and all differentiation, it has no unity and no parts. It cannot be articulately thought, asserted, and it has already lost its characteristic innocence, for assertion always implies a denial of something else. Stop to think of it, and it has flown. What the world was to Adam on the day he opened his eyes to it, before he had drawn any distinctions, or had become conscious of his own existence, that is first, present, immediate, fresh, new, initiative, original, spontaneous, free, vivid, conscious, and evanescent. Only, remember that every description of it must be false to it. Just as the first is not absolutely first if thought along with the second, so likewise to think the second in its perfection we must banish every third. The second is therefore the absolute last. But we need not, and must not, banish the idea of the first from the second. On the contrary, the second is precisely that which cannot be without the first. It meets us in such facts as another, relation, compulsion, effect, dependence, independence, negation, occurrence, reality, result. A thing cannot be other, negative, or independent, without a first to or of which it shall be other, negative, or independent. Still, this is not a very deep kind of secondness, for the first might in these cases be destroyed yet leave the real character of the second absolutely unchanged. When the second suffers some change from the action of the first, and is dependent upon it, the secondness is more genuine. But the dependence must not go so far that the second is a mere accident or incident of the first, otherwise the secondness again degenerates. The genuine second suffers and yet resists, like dead matter, whose existence consists in its inertia. Note, too, that for the second to have the finality that we have seen belongs to it, it must be determined by the first immovably, and thenceforth be fixed, so that unalterable fixity becomes one of its attributes. We find secondness in occurrence, because an occurrence is something whose existence consists in our knocking up against it. A hard fact is of the same sort, that is to say, it is something which is there, and which I cannot think away, but am forced to acknowledge as an object or second beside myself, the subject or number one, and which forms material for the exercise of my will. The idea of second must be reckoned as an easy one to comprehend. That of first is so tender that you cannot touch it without spoiling it, but that of second is eminently hard and tangible. It is very familiar, too, it is forced upon us daily, it is the main lesson of life. In youth, the world is fresh and we seem free, but limitation, conflict, constraint, and secondness generally, make up the teaching. Limitation, conflict, constraint, and secondness generally, make up the teaching of experience. With what firstness the scarf bark puts from her native bay, with what secondness doth she return, with overweathered ribs and ragged sails. But familiar as the notion is, and compelled as we are to acknowledge it at every turn, still we never can realize it, we never can be immediately conscious of finiteness, or of anything but a divine freedom that in its own original firstness knows no bounds. First and second, agent and patient, yes and no, are categories which enable us roughly to describe the facts of experience, and they satisfy the mind for a very long time. But at last they are found inadequate, and the third is the conception which is then called for. The third is that which bridges over the chasm between the absolute first and last, and brings them into relationship. We are told that every science has its qualitative and its quantitative stage. Now its qualitative stage is when dual distinctions whether a given subject has a given predicate or not suffice. The quantitative stage comes when, no longer content with such rough distinctions, we require to insert a possible halfway between every two possible conditions of the subject in regard to its possession of the quality indicated by the predicate. Ancient mechanics recognized forces as causes which produced motions as their immediate effects, looking no further than the essentially dual relation of cause and effect. That was why it could make no progress with dynamics. The work of Galileo and his successors lay in showing that forces are accelerations by which a state of velocity is gradually brought about. The words cause and effect still linger, but the old conceptions have been dropped from mechanical philosophy, for the fact now known is that in certain relative positions bodies undergo certain accelerations. Now an acceleration, instead of being like a velocity a relation between two successive positions, is a relation between three, so that the new doctrine has consisted in the suitable introduction of the conception of threeness. On this idea, the whole of modern physics is built. The superiority of modern geometry, too, has certainly been due to nothing so much as to the bridging over of the innumerable distinct cases with which the ancient science was encumbered, and we may go so far as to say that all the great steps in the method of science in every department have consisted in bringing into relation cases previously discrete. We can easily recognize the man whose thought is mainly in the dual stage by his unmeasured use of language. In former days, when he was natural, everything with him was unmitigated, absolute, ineffable, utter, matchless, supreme, unqualified, root and branch, but now that it is the fashion to be depreciatory, he is just as plainly marked by the ridiculous inadequacy of his expressions. The principle of contradiction is a shibboleth for such minds. To disprove a proposition they will always try to prove there lurks a contradiction in it, notwithstanding that it may be as clear and comprehensible as the day. Remark for your amusement the grand unconcern with which mathematics, since the invention of the calculus, has pursued its way, caring no more for the peppering of contradiction mongers than an ironclad for an American fort. We have seen that it is the immediate consciousness that is preeminently first, the external dead thing that is preeminently second. In like manner, it is evidently the representation mediating between these two that is preeminently third. Other examples, however, should not be neglected. The first is agent, the second patient, the third is the action by which the former influences the latter. Between the beginning as first, and the end as last, comes the process which leads from first to last. According to the mathematicians, when we measure along a line, were our yardstick replaced by a yard marked off on an infinitely long rigid bar, then in all the shiftings of it which we make for the purpose of applying it to successive portions of the line to be measured, 2 points on that bar would remain fixed and unmoved. To that pair of points, the mathematicians accord the title of the absolute. They are the points that are at an infinite distance one way and the other as measured by that yard. These points are either really distinct, coincident, or imaginary, in which case there is but a finite distance completely round the line, according to the relation of the mode of measurement to the nature of the line upon which the measurement is made. These 2 points are the absolute first and the absolute last or second, while every measurable point on the line is of the nature of a third. We have seen that the conception of the absolute first eludes every attempt to grasp it, and so in another sense does that of the absolute second, but there is no absolute third, for the third is of its own nature relative, and this is what we are always thinking, even when we aim at the first or second. The starting point of the universe, God the Creator, is the absolute first, the terminus of the universe, God completely revealed, is the absolute second, every state of the universe at a measurable point of time is the third. If you think the measurable is all there is, and deny it any definite tendency whence or whither, then you are considering the pair of points that makes the absolute to be imaginary and are an Epicurean. If you hold that there is a definite drift to the course of nature as a whole, but yet believe its absolute end is nothing but the nirvana from which it set out, you make the 2 points of the absolute to be coincident, and are a pessimist. But if your creed is that the whole universe is approaching in the infinitely distant future a state having a general character different from that toward which we look back in the infinitely distant past, you make the absolute to consist in 2 distinct real points and are an evolutionist. Point 1. This is one of the matters concerning which a man can only learn from his own reflections, but I believe that if my suggestions are followed out, the reader will grant that 1, 2, 3, are more than mere count words like eeny, meeny, miny, mo, but carry vast, though vague ideas. But it will be asked, why stop at 3? Why not go on to find a new conception in 4, 5, and so on indefinitely? The reason is that while it is impossible to form a genuine 3 by any modification of the pair, without introducing something of a different nature from the unit and the pair, 4, 5, and every higher number can be formed by mere complications of 3's. To make this clear, I will first show it in an example. The fact that a presence B with a gift C is a triple relation, and as such cannot possibly be resolved into any combination of dual relations. Indeed, the very idea of a combination involves that of thirdness, for a combination is something which is what it is owing to the parts which it brings into mutual relationship. But we may waive that consideration, and still we cannot build up the fact that a presence C to be by any aggregate of dual relations between A and B and C and A. A may enrich B may receive C, and A may part with C, and yet A need not necessarily give C to B. For that, it would be necessary that these 3 dual relations should not only coexist, but be welded into one fact. Thus, we see that a triad cannot be analyzed into dyads. But now I will show by an example that a 4 can be analyzed into 3's. Take the quadruple fact that a sell C to B for the price D. This is a compound of 2 facts. First, that A makes with C a certain transaction, which we may name E, and second, that this transaction E is a sale of B for the price D. Each of these 2 facts is a triple fact, and their combination makes up as genuine a quadruple fact as can be found. The explanation of this striking difference is not far to seek. A dual relative term, such as lover or tservat, is a sort of blank form, where there are 2 places left blank. I mean that in building a sentence round lover, as the principal word of the predicate, we are at liberty to make anything we see fit the subject, and then, besides that, anything we please the object of the action of loving. But a triple relative term such as giver has 2 correlates, and is thus a blank form with 3 places left blank. Consequently, we can take 2 of these triple relatives and fill up 1 blank place in each with the same letter, x, which has only the force of a pronoun or identifying index, and then the 2 taken together will form a whole having 4 blank places, and from that we can go on in a similar way to any higher number. But when we attempt to imitate this proceeding with dual relatives, and combine 2 of them by means of an x, we find we only have 2 blank places in the combination, just as we had in either of the relatives taken by itself. A road with only 3 way forkings may have any number of to many, but no number of straight roads put end on end will give more than 2 to many. Thus any number, however large, can be built out of triads, and consequently no idea can be involved in such a number, radically different from the idea of 3. I do not mean to deny that the higher numbers may present interesting special configurations from which notions may be derived of more or less general applicability, but these cannot rise to the height of philosophical categories so fundamental as those that have been considered. The argument of this book has been developed in the mind of the author, substantially as it is presented, as a following out of these 3 conceptions, in a sort of game of follow my leader from one field of thought into another. Their importance was originally brought home to me in the study of logic, where they play so remarkable a part that I was led to look for them in psychology. Finding them there again, I could not help asking myself whether they did not enter into the physiology of the nervous system. By drawing a little on hypothesis, I succeeded in detecting them there, and then the question naturally came how they would appear in the theory of protoplasm in general. Here I seem to break into an interesting avenue of reflections giving instructive appearances both into the nature of protoplasm and into the conceptions themselves, though it was not till later that I mapped out my thoughts on the subject as they are presented in Chapter 4. I had no difficulty in following the lead into the domain of natural selection, and once arrived at that point, I was irresistibly carried on to speculations concerning physics. One bold saltus landed me in a garden of fruitful and beautiful suggestions, the exploration of which long prevented my looking further. As soon, however, as I was induced to look further, and to examine the application of the 3 ideas to the deepest problems of the soul, nature, and God, I saw at once that they must carry me far into the heart of those primeval mysteries. That is the way the book has grown in my mind, it is also the order in which I have written it, and only this first chapter is more or less an afterthought, since at an earlier stage of my studies I should have looked upon the matter here set down as too vague to have any value. I should have discerned in it too strong a resemblance to many a crack-brained book that I had laughed over. A deeper study has taught me that even out of the mouths of babes and sucklings strength may be brought forth, and that weak metaphysical trash has sometimes contained the germs of conceptions capable of growing up into important and positive doctrines. Thus, the whole book being nothing but a continual exemplification of the triad of ideas, we need linger no longer upon this preliminary exposition of them. There is, however, one feature of them upon which it is quite indispensable to dwell. It is that there are 2 distinct grades of secondness and 3 grades of thirdness. There is a close analogy to this in geometry. Conic sections are either the curves usually so called, or they are pairs of straight lines. A pair of straight lines is called a degenerate conic. So plane cubic curves are either the genuine curves of the 3rd order, or they are conies paired with straight lines, or they consist of 3 straight lines, so that there are the 2 orders of degenerate cubics. Nearly in the same way, besides genuine secondness, there is a degenerate sort which does not exist as such, but is only so conceived. The medieval logicians, following a hint of Aristotle, distinguished between real relations and relations of reason. A real relation subsists in virtue of a fact which would be totally impossible were either of the related objects destroyed, while a relation of reason subsists in virtue of 2 facts, one only of which would disappear on the annihilation of either of the relates. Such are all resemblances, for any 2 objects in nature resemble each other, and indeed in themselves just as much as any other 2, it is only with reference to our senses and needs that one resemblance counts for more than another. Rumford and Franklin resembled each other by virtue of being both Americans, but either would have been just as much an American if the other had never lived. On the other hand, the fact that Cain killed Abel cannot be stated as a mere aggregate of 2 facts, one concerning Cain and the other concerning Abel. Resemblances are not the only relations of reason, though they have that character in an eminent degree. Contrasts and comparisons are of the same sort. Resemblance is an identity of characters, and this is the same as to say that the mind gathers the resembling ideas together into one conception. Other relations of reason arise from ideas being connected by the mind in other ways. They consist in the relation between two parts of one complex concept, or, as we may say, in the relation of a complex concept to itself, in respect to two of its parts. This brings us to consider a sort of degenerate secondness that does not fulfill the definition of a relation of reason. Identity is the relation that everything bears to itself. Lucullus dines with Lucullus. Again, we speak of allurements and motives in the language of forces, as though a man suffered compulsion from within. So with the voice of conscience, and we observe our own feelings by reflective sense. An echo is my own voice coming back to answer itself. So also, we speak of the abstract quality of a thing as if it were some second thing that the first thing possesses. But the relations of reason and these self-relations are alike in this, that they arise from the mind setting one part of a notion into relation to another. All degenerate seconds may be conveniently termed internal, in contrast to external seconds, which are constituted by external fact, and are true actions of one thing upon another. Among thirds, there are two degrees of degeneracy. The first is where there is in the fact itself no thirdness or mediation, but where there is true duality, the in the fact itself no thirdness or mediation, but where there is true duality. The second degree is where there is not even true secondness in the fact itself. Consider, first, the thirds degenerate in the first degree. A pin fastens two things together by sticking through one and also through the other, either might be annihilated, and the pin would continue to stick through the one which remained. A mixture brings its ingredients together by containing each. We may term these accidental thirds. How did I slay thy son? Asked the merchant, and the genie replied, when thou threwest away the date stone, it smote my son who was passing at the time, on the breast, and he died forthright. Here there were two independent facts, first that the merchant threw away the date stone, and second that the date stone struck and killed the genie's son. Had it been aimed at him, the case would have been different, for then there would have been a relation of aiming which would have connected together the aimer, the thing aimed, and the object aimed at, in one fact. What monstrous injustice and inhumanity on the part of that genie to hold that poor merchant responsible for such an accident. I remember how I wept at it, as I lay in my father's arms and he first told me the story. It is certainly just that a man, even though he had no evil intention, should be held responsible for the immediate effects of his actions, but not for such as might result from them in a sporadic case here and there, but only for such as might have been guarded against by a reasonable rule of prudence. Nature herself often supplies the place of the intention of a rational agent in making a thirdness genuine and not merely accidental, as when a spark, as third, falling into a barrel of gunpowder, as first, causes an explosion, as second. But how does nature do this? By virtue of an intelligible law according to which she acts. If two forces are combined according to the parallelogram of forces, their resultant is a real third. Yet any force may, by the parallelogram of forces, be mathematically resolved into the sum of two others, in an infinity of different ways. Such components, however, are mere creations of the mind. What is the difference? As far as one isolated event goes, there is none. The real forces are no more present in the resultant than any components that the mathematician may imagine. But what makes the real forces really there is the general law of nature which calls for them, and not for any other components of the resultant. Thus, intelligibility, or reason objectified, is what makes thirdness genuine. We now come to thirds degenerate in the second degree. The dramatist we now come to thirds degenerate in the second degree. The dramatist Marlowe had something of that character of diction in which Shakespeare and Bacon agree. This is a trivial example, but the mode of relation is important. In natural history, intermediate types serve to bring out the resemblance between forms whose similarity might otherwise escape attention, or not be duly appreciated. In portraiture, photographs mediate between the original and the likeness. In science, a diagram or analog of the observed fact leads on to a further analogy. The relations of reason which go to the formation of such a triple relation need not be all resemblances. Washington was eminently free from the faults in which most great soldiers resemble one another. A centaur is a mixture of a man and a horse. Philadelphia lies between New York and Washington. Such thirds may be called intermediate thirds or thirds of comparison. Nobody will suppose that I wish to claim any originality in reckoning the triad important in philosophy. Since Hegel, almost every fanciful thinker has done the same. Originality is the last of recommendations for fundamental conceptions. On the contrary, the fact that the minds of men have ever been inclined to threefold divisions is one of the considerations in favor of them. Other numbers have been objects of predilection to this philosopher and that, but three has been prominent at all times and with all schools. My whole method will be found to be in profound contrast with that of Hegel. I reject his philosophy in toto. Nevertheless, I have a certain sympathy with it, and fancy that if its author had only noticed a very few circumstances he would himself have been led to revolutionize his system. One of these is the double division or dichotomy of the second idea of the triad. He has usually overlooked external secondness, altogether. In other words, he has committed the trifling oversight of forgetting that there is a real world with real actions and reactions. Rather a serious oversight that. Then Hegel had the misfortune to be unusually deficient in mathematics. He shows this in the very elementary character of his reasoning. Worse still, while the whole burden of his song is that philosophers have neglected to take thirdness into account, which is true enough of the theological kind, with whom alone he was acquainted, for I do not call it acquaintance to look into a book without comprehending it, he unfortunately did not know, what it would have been of the utmost consequence for him to know, that the mathematical analysts had in great measure escaped this great fault, and that the thoroughgoing pursuit of the ideas and methods of the differential calculus would be sure to cure it altogether. Hegel's dialectical method is only a feeble and rudimentary application of the principles of the calculus to metaphysics. Finally, Hegel's plan of evolving everything out of the abstractest conception by a dialectical procedure, though far from being so absurd as the experientialists think, but on the contrary representing one of the indispensable parts of the course of science, overlooks the weakness of individual man, who wants the strength to wield such a weapon as that. Chapter V. The triad in physiology. Granted that there are three fundamentally different kinds of consciousness, it follows as a matter of course that there must be something threefold in the physiology of the nervous system to account for them. No materialism is implied in this, further than that intimate dependence of the action of the mind upon the body, which every student of the subject must and does now acknowledge. Once more a prediction, as it were, is made by the theory, that is to say, certain consequences, not contemplated in the construction thereof, necessarily result from it, and these are of such a character that their truth or falsehood can be independently investigated. Were we to find them strikingly and certainly true, a remarkable confirmation of the theory would be afforded. So much as this, however, I cannot promise. I can only say that they are not certainly false, and we must be content to trace out these consequences, and see what they are, and leave them to the future judgment of physiologists. Two of the three kinds of consciousness, indeed, the simple and dual, receive an instant physiological explanation. We know that the protoplasmic content of every nerve cell has its active and passive conditions, and argument is unnecessary to show that feeling, or immediate consciousness, arises in an active state of nerve cells. Experiments on the effects of cutting the nerves show that there is no feeling after communication with the central nerve cells is severed, so that the phenomenon has certainly some connection with the nerve cells, and feeling is excited by just such stimuli as would be likely to throw protoplasm into an active condition. Thus, though we cannot say that every nerve cell in its active condition has feeling, which we cannot deny, however, there is scarce room to doubt that the activity of nerve cells is the main physiological requisite for consciousness. On the other hand, the sense of action and reaction, or the polar sense, as we agreed to call it, is plainly connected with the discharge of nervous energy through the nerve fibers. External volition, the most typical case of it, involves such a discharge into muscle cells. In external sensation, where the polar sense enters in a lower intensity, there is a discharge from the terminal nerve cell through the afferent nerve upon a cell or cells in the brain. In internal volition, or self-control, there is some inhibitory action of the nerves, which is also known to involve the movement of nervous force, and in internal observation, or visceral sensation, there are doubtless transfers of energy from one central cell to another. Remembering that the polar sense is the sense of the difference between what was before and what is after a dividing instant, or the sense of an instant as having sides, we see clearly that the physiological concomitant of it must be some event which happens very quickly and leaves a more abiding effect, and this description suits the passage of a nervous discharge over a nerve fiber so perfectly, that I do not think we need hesitate to set this phenomenon down as the condition of dual consciousness. Synthetic consciousness offers a more difficult problem. Yet the explanation of the genuine form of that consciousness, the sense of learning, is easy enough. It is only the degenerate modes, the sense of similarity, and the sense of real connection, which oblige us to hesitate. With regard to these two degenerate forms, I am driven to make hypotheses. When two ideas resemble one another, we say that they have something in common. A part of the one is said to be identical with a part of the other. In what does that identity consist? Having closed both eyes, I open first one and then shut it and open the other, and I say that the two sensations are alike. How can the impressions of two nerves be judged to be alike? It appears to me that in order that that should become possible, the two nerve cells must probably discharge themselves into one common nerve cell. In any case, it seems to me that the first supposition to make, for scientific observation to confirm or reject, is that two ideas are alike so far as the same nerve cells have been concerned in the production of them. In short, the hypothesis is that resemblance consists in the identity of a common element, and that that identity lies in a part of the one idea and a part of the other idea being the feeling peculiar to the excitation of one or more nerve cells. When we find ourselves under a compulsion to think that two elements of experience which do not particularly resemble one another are, nevertheless, really connected, that connection must, I think, be due in some way, to a discharge of nerve energy, for the whole sense of reality is a determination of polar consciousness, which is itself due to such discharges. For example, I recognize that a certain surface, on one side of a certain boundary is red, and on the other side is blue, or that any two qualities are immediately contiguous in space or time. If the contiguity is in time, it is by the polar sense directly that we are conscious of a dividing instant with its difference on the two sides. If the contiguity is in space, I think we have at first a completely confused feeling of the whole, as yet unanalyzed and unscientized, but afterward, when the analysis has been made, we find ourselves compelled, in recomposing the elements, to pass directly from what is on one side of the boundary to what is on the other. I suppose then that we are compelled to think the two feelings as contiguous because the nerve cell whose excitation produces the feeling of one recalled sensation discharges itself into the nerve cell whose excitation makes the feeling of the other recalled sensation. The genuine synthetic consciousness, or the sense of the process of learning, which is the preeminent ingredient and quintessence of reason, has its physiological basis quite evidently in the most characteristic property of the nervous system, the power of taking habits. This depends on 5 principles, as follows. First, when a stimulus or irritation is continued for some time, the excitation spreads from the cells directly affected to those that are associated with it, and from those to others, and so on, and at the same time increases in intensity. Second, after a time, fatigue begins to set in. Now besides the utter fatigue which consists in the cells losing all excitability, and the nervous system refusing to react to the stimulus at all, there is a gentler fatigue, which plays a very important part in adapting the brain to serving as an organ of reason, this form of fatigue consisting in the reflex action or discharge of the nerve cells ceasing to go on one path and either beginning on a path where there had been no discharge, or increasing the intensity of the discharge along a path on which there had been previously only a slight discharge. For example, one may sometimes see a frog whose cerebrum or brain has been removed, and whose hind leg has been irritated by putting a drop of acid upon it, after repeatedly rubbing the place with the other foot, as if to wipe off the acid, may at length be observed to give several hops, the first avenue of nervous discharge having become fatigued. Third, when, from any cause the stimulus to a nerve cell is removed, the excitation quickly subsides. That it does not do so instantly is well known, and the phenomenon goes among physicists by the name of persistence of sensation. All noticeable feeling subsides in a fraction of a second, but a very small remnant continues for a much longer time. Fourth, if the same cell which was once excited, and which by some chance had happened to discharge itself along a certain path or paths, comes to get excited a second time, it is more likely to discharge itself the second time along some or all of those paths along which it had previously discharged itself than it would have been had it not so discharged itself before. This is the central principle of habit, and the striking contrast of its modality to that of any mechanical law is most significant. The laws of physics know nothing of tendencies or probabilities. Whatever they require at all they require absolutely and without fail, and they are never disobeyed. Were the tendency to take habits replaced by an absolute requirement that the cell should discharge itself always in the same way, or according to any rigidly fixed condition whatever, all possibility of habit developing into intelligence would be cut off at the outset, the virtue of thirdness would be absent. It is essential that there should be an element of chance in some sense as to how the cell shall discharge itself, and then that this chance or uncertainty shall not be entirely obliterated by the principle of habit, but only somewhat affected. Fifth, when a considerable time has elapsed without a nerve having reacted in any particular way, there comes in a principle of forgetfulness or negative habit rendering it the less likely to react in that way. Now let us see what will be the result of these 5 principles taken in combination. When a nerve is stimulated, if the reflex activity is not at first of the right sort to remove the source of irritation, it will change its character again and again until the cause of irritation is removed, when the activity will quickly subside. When the nerve comes to be stimulated a second time in the same way, probably some of the other movements which had been made on the first occasion will be repeated, but, however this may be, one of them must ultimately be repeated, for the activity will continue until this does occur, I mean that movement which removes the source of irritation. On a third occasion, the process of forgetfulness will have been begun in regard to any tendency to repeat any of the actions of the first occasion which were not repeated on the second. Of those which were repeated, some will probably be repeated again, and some not, but always there remains that one which must be repeated before the activity comes to an end. The ultimate effect of this will inevitably be that a habit gets established of at once reacting in the way which removes the source of irritation, for this habit alone will be strengthened at each repetition of the experiment, while every other will tend to become weakened at an accelerated rate. I have invented a little game or experiment with playing cards to illustrate the working of these principles, and I can promise the reader that if he will try it half a dozen times he will be better able to estimate the value of the account of habit here proposed. The rules of this game are as follows. Take a good many cards of 4 suits, say a pack of 52, though fewer will do. The 4 suits are supposed to represent 4 modes in which a cell may react. Let one suit, say spades, represent that mode of reaction which removes the source of irritation and brings the activity to an end. In order readily to find a card of any suit as wanted, you had better lay all the cards down face up and distribute it into 4 packets, each containing the cards of one suit only. Now take 2 spades, 2 diamonds, 2 clubs, and 2 hearts, to represent the original disposition of the nerve cell, which is supposed to be equally likely to react in any of the 4 ways. You turn these 8 cards face down and shuffle them with extreme thoroughness. Point 2 Then turn up cards from the top of this pack, one by one until a spade is reached. This process represents the reaction of the cell. Take up the cards just dealt off, and add to the pack held in the hand 1 card of each of those suits that have just been turned up, for habit, and remove from the pack 1 card of each suit not turned up, for forgetfulness. Shuffle, and go through with this operation 13 times or until the spades are exhausted. It will then generally be found that you hold nothing but spades in your hand. Thus we see how these principles not only lead to the establishment of habits, but to habits directed to definite ends, namely the removal of sources of irritation. Now it is precisely action according to final causes which distinguishes mental from mechanical action, and the general formula of all our desires may be taken as this: to remove a stimulus. Every man is busily working to bring to an end that state of things which now excites him to work. Notes 1. The last view is essentially that of Christian theology. 2. The theologians hold the physical universe to be finite, but considering that universe which they will admit to have existed from all time, it would appear to be in a different condition in the end from what it was in the beginning, the whole spiritual creation having been accomplished, and abiding. 2 cards are almost never shuffled enough to illustrate fairly the principles of probabilities, but if after being shuffled in any of the usual ways, they are dealt into 3 packs and taken up again, and then passed from one hand into the other one by one, every other one going to the top and every other to the bottom of the pack that thus accumulates in the second hand, and finally cut, the shuffling may be considered as sufficient for the purpose of this game. Whenever the direction is to shuffle, shuffling as thorough as this is meant.